Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Roy, and I'm the college's Chief Diversity Officer. Welcome to Teaching Inclusively and Equitably, Understanding Implicit Bias and Microaggressions in Everyday Life. In this series, higher education practitioners share the techniques they use to engage all students and to help them to succeed, regardless of their race, ethnicity, age, ability, gender identity, socioeconomic status, or family background. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. David P. Rivera, an Associate Professor of Counselor Education at Queens College, City University of New York. Dr. Rivera consults on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. His research explores cultural competency development and issues impacting the marginalization and well-being of people of color and oppressed sexual orientation and gender identity groups, with a focus on microaggressions. Dr. Rivera has planned a thought-provoking presentation that is designed to help us recognize and address the impact of implicit bias and microaggressions on the well-being of people from marginalized backgrounds. So please remain muted until asked to speak. We will be sharing a slide presentation during this session. We recommend you choose the side-by-side mode from view options in Zoom so that you can see both the speaker and the presentation at the same time. Feel free to ask questions using the chat function at any time, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions later in the program. We are recording today's program and we'll post it on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. Now I will turn the program over to Dr. Rivera.
Thanks so much, Melissa, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to share about implicit bias and microaggressions and how they impact everyday life, but especially our lives in academia. I also want to share that, and I have community college experience and just feel very grateful to be able to share this information with you. I've worked previously at Bronx Community College within the City University of New York system and also Prince George's Community College. So just really appreciate the spirit and function and necessity of our junior colleges in our country. So thank you all for being here. And we're going to be talking about some things that I'm sure you've already been aware of. I'm sure that you've heard the terms implicit bias, microaggression, social justice, racial trauma, all of these terms. I've been doing a lot of soul searching over the pandemic, which I'm sure many of us have, and some reframing. And some of the positives that have come out have been a heightened attention on issues of social justice, including kind of revisiting implicit bias, something that is not new by any means. It's been around for over 20 years as a concept and as a phenomenon, a study, but really revisiting it in terms of how it impacts us, but also how it's a part of systemic oppression and systemic racism when we think about implicit biases related to race. So just to kind of think about how pernicious and insidious implicit bias is in our society, we really have to look no further than ads or to the media, right? And so if we look at this New York Times Instagram or Twitter posting, I forget which one it's from in particular, but this is one of the first reports of the coronavirus in the United States in New York. So this was probably sometime in February, March of 2020 already, right? So really thinking about what was going on during that time and thinking about the rhetoric of this virus. And so, this says, the New York State reported its first case of coronavirus of a woman in her late 30s who had traveled to Iran. Also noteworthy is that this was a woman living in Manhattan. However, look at the image that the New York Times chose to put, right? So this is a woman traveling from Iran, living in Manhattan. Yet, if you're able to visualize this image, this is actually of one of the 3 Chinatowns in New York, not even the one in Manhattan. This is from the one in Flushing, Queens, right down the street from where I teach at Queens College. And so looking at this image, if you just glance at it, likely are not going to catch kind of the implicit biases inherent in this, right? And so going off of the rhetoric that of calling this the China virus, et cetera, what the World Health Organization advised against, we don't call illnesses by their countries that they may have originated from, because we know that only leads to bias and discrimination. And that's kind of what that is exactly what we see happening in this image. We fast forward, right, a few months into the pandemic, and social distancing and policing social distancing was especially an issue in many of the metropolitan areas of our country, especially New York. And I was kind of happy that we were taking it seriously. However, I wasn't kind of pleased in terms of who was being policed more frequently. And so just pulling up ads from early May from the headlines from the papers, and we see that Black and Latinos and those communities were reporting higher instances of being policed for social distancing violations. So I live in Brooklyn. I happened to go for a long walk that day into Brooklyn Heights, a predominantly a white living area in the city. And people were congregating in mass, playing contact sports, basketball. There were park rangers walking through the park. None of these gatherings that were in blatant violation of social distancing were broken up. So just kind of juxtaposing those experiences, we see, certain communities are targeted more frequently from policing. And where does that come from? Fast forward to just the 25th, which I believe was 2 days ago, and pulled this up from the headlines. So again, you don't have to look much further than the headlines to kind of see instances of implicit bias and microaggression and systemic oppression. And we see that, anti-Asian hate crimes rose 73% over the last year. Not surprising. Again, the rhetoric of just calling the coronavirus by a country of origin name has already done its damage, right? This also isn't to say that there wasn't pre-existing anti-Asian American Pacific Islander bias. There was. We just saw that it rose. So with everything that we've been dealing with in the pandemic, we've noticed that there have been not a creation of disparities, but rather an unveiling of the disparities that previously existed across all sectors of society, including healthcare. Right, that's kind of why we've deemed it the double or sometimes even triple pandemic that we've been living in. Right, so we have the intersection of health, so the pandemic, the coronavirus, and of race issues that we've been contending with in this country for centuries, right? And these came to a head. Whenever this country experiences any natural or human-made disaster, we often see that it is those that are socially marginalized that take the brunt of the impact, right? So we see disparities just become more egregious for these communities. We can think back to Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. It was the Black citizens of New Orleans that bore the brunt economically and to their lives from that tragedy. And then we look at the coronavirus, and we still see that it is people of color that are dying in larger numbers compared to their white counterparts in this country. And so again, this just brings to light the inequities that were previously existing. And we're going to talk some about what implicit bias has to do with this. So we're going to have a couple breakouts. And so I'm going to ask you to go into a breakout, have a little bit of a meet and greet. So introduce yourselves. This is also an opportunity for that in-person or online kind of variation of the in-person interaction that we would have had if we were in person. So in the breakout rooms, introduce yourself briefly, and then just share kind of what your impressions or your knowledge or your understandings are of implicit bias. So answering that question, what is implicit bias? What do you know about it? And just start from there, right? And so if we can break into the breakout rooms, please. All right. Well, I'm hoping that spurred some conversation, at least a starting point about what implicit bias is, and at least gave you an opportunity to either say hi to an old friend or colleague or meet somebody new. All right, and so instead of me giving the definition, and I found this this very cool video that kind of elegantly describes it from the mouths of the originators, Mahzarin Banaji at Harvard, Anthony Greenwald at University of Washington, and Brian Nosek are credited with being the originators of the implicit bias test or associations test, and giving us all of the data that we have from the 2 decades that they have been gathering data with this test. So let's hear from their mouths what this is all about. Sorry.
The best way to think about implicit bias is that it's a collection of all the experiences that we have in the world. We have a certain kind of brain. It has learned to detect information in the world as it sees it, store it, and not have to recompute every time. turns out our brains are screwed up in that they don't learn accurately.
In the late 1980s, we started a line of work which became the work on implicit social cognition.
Most of the implicit bias work that we did to start was about social groups, how it is that I might perceive people based on gender or age or race or sexual orientation and make judgments about them, not even necessarily intending to. I don't have to ask you how you feel about racial groups or gender groups. Instead, I just measure that indirectly. How easily can you associate black faces with good words compared to white faces with good words?
The first test I ever took was a race test. I know who I am. I'm the great Nazarene, the egalitarian who's been teaching about all of this stuff. I can associate white and black equally with good and bad. So I do it. White and good, black and bad. Easy peasy. I switch. And my brain has just slowed down.
First of all, I was shocked to discover that I had in me something I wasn't aware of.
It put us in a 2x2 box and didn't let us escape. It said, Mazarine, sit here and confront this. And so the first studies we did were at Yale and at University of Washington on our own students. And then in 1998, we began to worry that maybe people will write this off by saying, oh, college students, who cares?
And so I started to make pitches to Mazarine and Tony saying we could put this on the internet.
We were expecting that we'd put the test up and maybe 500 people would show up in the first year. And in the first month, we had 45,000 completed tests. And in that moment, I knew the horse has left the barn.
We didn't know that we were working on something that could prove practically important.
There are many organizations now that want to confront this. Police departments, military, which have been moving to understand these issues in a wonderful way. So much really good work has already been done that it gives us the luxury now of taking a step back and asking one interesting question, and that is, how do we change ourselves?
And that is the $500 billion, trillion question is how do we change ourselves? Thankfully, we are getting some good information about how to go about that unintentionally or intentional unlearning process of our biases, but it's going to be difficult. You know, as Dr. Banaji explained, you know, our brains are messed up in a way, right? You know, our brains are trained from very early to develop stereotype, right? We use stereotype to kind of make sense and memorize and internalize the functionality of everything that we come across so that we can be as effective as possible, right? So holding this up right here, if you can visually see this, you can probably identify it as a pen, right? We know that we use it to write primarily as a writing implement. As human beings, we tend to be imitative learners compared to other creatures, which tend to be emulative. They tend to like to learn a new use for objects, whereas we like to internalize a specific use for objects. But we do that with people as well. We do that with everything we come across. And that is why we develop the biases that we have currently. Additionally, what I want to point out, you know, as a researcher, and as a psychologist who has developed instruments in the past and who has used instruments and tests in my research, I know that the one who develops the test is often able to beat the test. However, this implicit associations test was even unbeatable by its developers, right? Which surprised them because they also know that to be a truth in terms of psychometrics and what have you, is that we often know how to beat it if you develop it. But this one, they created such a savvy test that they couldn't even beat this test, right? And they created such a savvy test that it gained so much popularity that just in the first month of administering it, they had 45,000 voluntary administration, something that is unheard of in the research world. So it's good to think about all those factors in terms of giving credence to what implicit bias is, given that there is still an incredible kind of anti-wave against implicit bias in today's society. But the data that we have supporting it is really hard to contend with. So how is it unique? It's different from our known biases. By and large, people are going to probably say vocally that they are egalitarian in nature. Even Dr. Banaji described herself as an egalitarian. However, when she took the IAT, that was kind of proven wrong. Her ideas were not egalitarian. Her thoughts for race were not egalitarian, right? And the IAT kind of revealed that. So they're known from our declared beliefs, right? So it's really important to think about that we can't just do this work by going off of what we think we know, right? We need assistance to kind of help us reveal what our implicit biases are, because they're so deeply ingrained in us, right? They're so deeply ingrained that we can't just sit down and journal about them, right? Without having some idea about what they might be. So they develop across our lifespan through indirect and direct messaging, right? Often starting with our families of origin, whatever that may have looked like, in our communities of origin, right? Whatever information was being filtered to us as young people is often the base or the foundation of what we develop into, right? So it's often even good to think about what were some of those messages that I heard in my home, even if we don't believe with them. I have so many friends who talk about maybe their parents or grandparents being of a different generation and how they have a hard time having social justice conversations with them. And they often find themselves to believe differently and feel themselves to be differently. I think that's great that we analyze it that way, but I also don't want us to kind of completely remove ourselves from those experiences, because they have seeped in some kind of way. Even if we declare otherwise, there's likely to still be some subconscious thoughts and values that we have taken from our families of origin, even those that in our communities of origin, even those that we, again, don't vocally agree with or consciously agree with, but there probably is still something there. So that indirect messaging is also harmful. I want to think about some of those direct and indirect messaging. And so if we think about our campus environments, I like to think about who are students coming into contact with. We often focus on the student population, right? How diverse is the student population? Knowing that these are the peers that the students are going to hopefully find community with. And so it's important to think about that demographic. We rarely or less do we think about what is the demographic of the faculty and staff on campus. And that's also important, right? We're the ones that tend to persist on campus longer than students, right? If we maintain our jobs. And so our views, our ways of being are going to have a big shaping or an influence on the shaping of the campus climate and what students are going to enter into. I'm more concerned though with the lack of representation. And so if we look at the faculty, we can see that number drastically declines for many of the groups, right? Except for if we parse out Asian and Pacific Islander, we see that for Asian students, they are and for white students, they are likely to encounter a professor that may look like them. But even for Asian students, it's only 10%. So we have to think about the other 90%, who are they? Right, but we go to other groups such as Latinx folks, such as Black folks, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous people, people that are multiracial. If we look at these stats, and again, these stats are an aggregate, as if the entire population of our nation's colleges and universities were one college. This is what it would look like, right? And so we know that there's differences. We know that hopefully urban centers more than likely are going to have a larger percentages, but even that's going to vary. But it's good to think about what that might look like on our own campuses. If we know that there is a significant disparity of faculty in any one of these racial groups, that's going to send a message to students about a representation. Think about a student who maybe is a Black student and they are taking accounting, right? However, they never have a Black professor teach them accounting, right? They may not consciously think about that influence on their professional development or their career development. However, there is a subconscious process going on there, right? It's sending the indirect message of not belonging, right? If I don't see people that look like me participate in my chosen field of study that I hope to have a flourishing career in, that's probably going to send a message about my worthiness, right, in that career or that discipline, right? This may be a reason why we see disparities in educational attainment for students of color, and why we often see a starker or a higher percentage of students of color who don't make it past the first year compared to their white counterparts. Right? So thinking about representation, and not just representation for representation's sake, but what representation is sending, those messages of inclusiveness and of belonging that that's sending to our students. We also don't have to look much further than the media and ads. Marketing and advertising, they maximize stereotype, right? They base a lot of their messaging on stereotype. So thinking about mainstream stereotype, and they often go along with that. And so if we think about how marketing is done, I don't think I've ever looked at a popular magazine without finding at least a few microaggressions embedded in the marketing, let alone the direct content of that periodical. But we look at this ad is from Rivera. It says white is purity. And we probably most people are probably thinking white as a color that is used to signify cleanliness or dirtiness, right? So we use colors for a variety of reasons. We use colors to signify this cleanliness, right? But we also use colors to signify race. And when we do that, there's the chance that we're going to fall into the trap of mixing up messaging, right? And so in this messaging, the intention was probably to signify white as being clean, not white as the race. However, that is very problematic when we're using white as a racial group as well, right? And then we have this related to purity that can kind of conjure eugenics and those kinds of things, kind of mass genocides that have occurred because of various types of messaging in our world. And so thinking about that type of messaging and what that's sending to people, this doesn't even require someone to be interacting with another person. All they need to do is flip through the pages of a magazine or click on a button on social media or on their computer, and they're presented with these biased messages regarding race. What's also important to think about is who is missing, right? Who is missing from representations on our campuses, in the media, in television, in our professions, et cetera, in roles of leadership. Omission is also harmful. And so when we're not seeing, adequate numbers of people in our communities, such as, same-sex families, people from non-Christian religions, people of color, we still have a lot of way to go in terms of upping the representation of various groups across society and across sectors. So just a few things, again, to reiterate: implicit bias, every single one of us has them. I have them. When we get it to the IAT test, I talk about it, I still force myself to take the implicit associations test on an annual basis. And it still reveals some of the same patterns that are very disturbing to me, but now that I know and I accept to be truths and things that are going to remind me to work on my beliefs. Again, they don't necessarily align with our declared beliefs, which is why it's important that we take something like the IAT and that we communicate with people who are outside of our group so that we can have folks kind of give us their feedback about how they are receiving and taking in us as people. In general, we tend to favor our in-groups. That kind of makes sense, right? Oftentimes our families and communities of origin kind of match how we look and sound and how we operate culturally. Again, that's not the same for everybody, but for many people, that's the case. And so it's not surprising that we're going to tend to favor people from our own groups. I tend to blame that old brain that we still have operating that is in charge of fight or flight. Still very powerful. And I still think that it still has a lot to say with, or a lot of influence. I still think that older brain has a lot of influence in terms of how we make sense and understand the world around us. But the good news is, as I mentioned before, we can change our biases, but it comes with an intentional unlearning of these biases, which is not an easy process, but it is a process that we can work on a daily basis. So as I mentioned, the implicit associations test has been around for over 20 years. That's the video that you watched of the originators of the IAT. They were celebrating the 20-year anniversary with a major award that they had won because of the groundbreaking work that this has done and how it's really proliferated across most sectors of society and even globally. So I have a couple polls that I'd like to launch right now. They are polls that are gonna give us information about what the IAT has revealed. And so these are true or false questions. And so from this 20 years of research, do you think that people have a moderate to strong preference for racially white people over Black people? True or false? So this is from the aggregate data. This is what this 20 years of data is telling us. And we want to have you answer the same for age. Do you think that this data is saying that people tend to favor old people or young people over older people regardless of age? True or false? So just answer these true or false questions. So the poll will probably be up for another few seconds or so. All right. So I think you can see the results now, and they thankfully are going in line with what the results of the IAT reveal. So the results of the IAT reveal that people overall, regardless of their racial background, have a moderate to strong preference for racially white people over racially Black people. Now, this even occurs for racially Black people. Again, this just points out how insidious and how pernicious these messages are across all sectors of society, from cradle to the grave. We're inundated with this messaging. The same for age. We tend to favor younger people over older people regardless of age. And we know that in this country especially, we haven't done the best job taking care of our older people in our society. You know, more collective societies have done a better job taking care of their older people and actually prize them a bit more than we do in our individualistic society. But we still have a preference for younger people over older people. Now, with this data, it's important that we think about the utility of it. And so knowing this, right, whenever I'm involved in any kind of decision-making processes where maybe we're on a search committee or maybe we're developing a policy, right, I'm gonna think about the general implicit biases that folks have, the ones that I have, and use that data to kind of inform our decision-making processes, which means that sometimes I might need to pause a meeting and think about, okay, what are our biases going in? And I'll be the first to share. My IAT still reveal that I have a stronger preference for racially white people over racially Black people. And I've been involved in the work of social justice since I was an undergraduate student over 20 years ago to this current day. All my work lives in here, and I still have the implicit bias that I wish I didn't have, but that I know I'm going to have because of how I'm socially normed in this country. And the same for age. A bulk of my best friends happen to be people that are in their 70s and above, very purposefully. However, I still, my IAT still reveals that I have a stronger preference for younger people over older people. And again, that goes in line with the messaging that I receive in society. So what this tells me is that I still have work to do on a regular basis, which means I have to reflect on these biases frequently. I also want us to think about where these implicit biases come from. Again, they don't just develop out of nowhere, right? We are normed with these from birth until the day that we die. Regardless of where we are of them, we are still subject to falling into the trappings of being implicitly biased, right? And so where does it come from? These implicit biases stem from structural oppression. When we think about implicit biases that are about race, they result from structural racism, right? I'm going to talk about a little bit about critical race theory here. Now, something that has of major debate in society when it shouldn't be. It's only of major debate because it's being debated under false pretenses. The way that it's described in the media is not really what, unless you hear one of the experts speaking, it is not really what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is just saying that when we take a historical view of this country and how this country was founded, right? How it was founded off of genocide of indigenous people, and how literally the structures that many of us still navigate on a daily basis were built by Black people that were forcibly stolen from their own countries and forced to live as slaves, as less than human people in this country. And then we think about how all the other people that have come to this country, especially people of color from Asia, from Central and South America, from Africa, from other countries, how oftentimes with their arrival, we'll also introduce laws that controlled their participation in this society, right? And so we have to think about the historical legacy that we live in. And that's really what critical race theory is encouraging us to do, is to think of that historical legacy and to think about how our structures, including education, were built off of oppression. And there are still oppressive structures that operate to this very day, right? We can even think about the tenure processes that we often prize in academia. Those aren't equitable processes, quite frankly. They're often anything that is shrouded in mystery, which tenure often is often shrouded also in oppression, right? There's a reason for that, right? And we need to interrogate these more often. And so our implicit biases result from the structures of oppression that we navigate on a daily basis, right? We're not born with them, right? We are normed into them. And we are then, and those norms are supported on a regular basis in these structures. And then we come to microaggressions, and we want to think about these three concepts in unison. We often think about them differently, but they all work together and they're all part of the same fabric. They're different concepts though. And so we have structural oppression, where our implicit biases kind of develop, right? And then microaggressions, which are how our biases are communicated, right, are merely the glue that keep structural oppression together, right? These are the everyday interactions that we have. They could be interpersonal, right? They could be via the verbalizations that we have, the conversations, how we behaviorally carry our bodies, but they can also be embedded in the environments that we navigate on a regular basis, such as the demographics, right, that of our campus communities, right? Such as when we walk into a boardroom and we see the board of directors, right? Are they inclusive? Right? What message is that telling us? If we walk into the president's office and we see the portraits of all the previous presidents, right? Do most of them kind of look like me? Do most of them kind of sound like me or share a cultural tradition with me? If not, that's going to send a message about my welcoming or how welcome I am in that environment. Anyhow, these microaggressions again are the manifestations or how systemic oppression lives on, right, via our daily interactions. They can be intentional or unintentional. Oftentimes they're unintentional, and that's really important to think about, because when we address microaggressions, oftentimes the reply is, I didn't mean for that to happen, or that wasn't my intention. And we can't let a conversation live only in intention, right? The law doesn't allow us to do that. When we think about unintentional acts of murder, right, we call that manslaughter in the law, right? And that's still punishable. However, we don't kind of use that same kind of frame when it comes to our everyday instances with discrimination and bias, right? We still try to think about those as being one-off issues, somebody having a bad day, or somebody just making a mistake, or somebody joking around. And I'm like, nope, those all might be the case. However, these are still going to operate because they are part of the system of oppression that we find ourselves living in. And so we want to have an impact conversation. And we're going to talk a bit more about that when I give you a rubric for addressing microaggressions when they happen. But we want to think about the impact that microaggressions have, because regardless of the intention, the impact still happens. The impact still lasts. Just as with unintentional acts of murder, that person is still dead, right? Even though it wasn't intended, that person is still dead, and we still need to hold the person accountable for that. So I'm going to do another short breakout room. We're going to see how this goes. And so what I want you to do is I'm going to show you an image, and I want you to kind of take in this image, think about how it makes you feel. So what are the emotions that are evoked? What are the thoughts that come to your mind? And then what is the message that you're taking away from this image, right? So I'm going to show one image, let you view it for about 30 seconds, and then we're going to break into breakout rooms only for a few minutes, where you're going to share your impressions with a partner. And then we're going to come back to the main room. Okay, so look at this image. What feelings is this image communicating or kind of bringing up in you? What are the thoughts that are coming to mind? And then what is the message that you're walking away with after viewing this image? All right, welcome back, everyone. Okay, given the size of our group, if anybody would just like to verbalize what some of their takeaways were from this image. Feel free to just unmute yourself. Inez?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were asking me. So you were asking what did I take away from this? As far as feeling, I feel very uncomfortable. It's I'm thinking that in some way, shape, or form, people of Asian background are being made fun of, or perhaps this individual's, the one individual from that group is being made fun of. Now, what's unclear is whether he is seeing what I'm seeing, because they're all facing the camera. So I don't know if it's being done behind his back or, so it's, and so we had a conversation about how difficult it is. It appears to be a social setting, so I'm assuming they're friends. And I made a comment that when I've been the recipient or on the receiving end of a microaggression, how much harder it is to confront that when you are with friends.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier perhaps if you don't know the person, but when you do know the person, that's more challenging,
Mm-hmm.
and it's also more hurtful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and everything you said is true. A close friend of mine that I studied with when we were doing our microaggression research studied that exact phenomenon of, is there a difference between how the impact is for someone who is a close relation as opposed to a far relation or a stranger? And it kind of makes sense. Those that we care about, we have closer attachments to, which makes sense why they often can hurt us much easier, right? But to your point, it can be also more difficult to challenge those that are close to us, especially when we're having to reveal that, is there a bias going on here against not just me, but people that I represent or that you think I represent, right? And so how great is that? But these are conversations that I want to say that can be had, right? With some direction, with some practice, et cetera. I've had plenty of these, if you can imagine, I've had plenty of these conversations, probably with every single person that I know in my life. My mom, my younger sister, my younger brother, best friends, people that I've even been romantically engaged with, they will inevitably come out, right? But there are ways to do it. Christina.
Hi, yeah, so in our small group, something that I shared was, this photo, I agree with Inez, I think it was who's speaking, made me uncomfortable. At first I thought, oh, college party, this could, this brought me back to my college days. And then as I look closely at the photo, for me, it sort of took me back to my experiences in undergrad and my experiences of being the only person of color in my social groups, and feeling very much like, wondering at times if these people were laughing at me or with me, and for me, it stirred up my own, what I realize and identify as to be my own implicit bias, because I look at this and for some reason it doesn't shock me. And I'm like, you know what, this is typical of students, particularly Caucasian students, that are not considering this young man's feelings and what this looks like. And I had to catch myself and name that in that moment of, yep, this is the bias though, but it's based upon my personal experiences. It doesn't mean that every student, Caucasian student is not. It doesn't mean that other racial groups are not capable of this kind of behavior. But like I said, I had to catch myself and realize that that was a bias, but it was strongly tied to a personal experience.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Christina. And these are exactly the kind of conversations that we need to be having. And you can even use something like this in your own kind of workspace if you want to instigate conversations, because we often have to instigate conversations about social justice issues, that we can use images. And it's like, what does this image mean to you? Let's have a conversation, because we know that imagery is going to land on everyone differently, right? And it's really good it's really helpful to understand how the imagery lands on people differently, and then to have conversations so that we can build understanding about why I might be seeing it this way, and maybe somebody else is seeing it a different way, right? The whole goal is to build understanding. Is that Leah?
Yes. I just want to say something about this because when I first saw this, I think the young man here in the front, he is Japanese. People oftentimes do not distinguish Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese, but we can. So I'm pretty sure he's Japanese. And then all of his friends here is like they have somehow agreed to make fun of him in this photograph. If you look at everyone squint their eyes the ways they're doing. I think they think this is funny, but it's actually not. It's very hurtful. And I feel sorry for this young man. He doesn't know all his friends are here making this pose because they all agreed to do this to make it seem like a joke. Maybe from their point of view, they were making a joke, but it's very hurtful. So that's how I see it.
Definitely. I see it very, very similarly. Yes. I've been using this image. This was in the very first presentation that I did on microaggressions. And this was almost 15 years ago. And I was really hoping naively, I'm like, hopefully I'll be able to change up my slides, the imagery. This will become hopefully something that people just won't do anymore. But lo and behold, this image is extremely relevant today when we that the rise in anti-Asian American Pacific Islander hate, this kind of thing contributes to it, right? Whenever anybody uses the excuse of it was a joke, I often reply, because I'm a big jokester. I'm one of the biggest jokesters out there. And I even know that my jokes contain a half truth or a semblance of the truth, right? And so I even will throw that back, every joke has a half truth to it. There's a reason why it's coming out. Jokes are a mode of communication, right? And a meaningful mode of communication, one that can be used for good, but also one that can be used to harm people a lot and can be used also as a curtain or a guise to hide people's biases as well. And I'm like, oh, that was just a joke, or oh, I just didn't intend to do that. Okay, now let's talk about that, right? That doesn't mean that just because it was a joke or you didn't intend it doesn't mean that we're not going to have a conversation. But now let's have a conversation about how come you viewed that to be a joke or it wasn't intentional. Let's think about now the harm, because I was viewing harm. As somebody who is just a vicarious observer, I was enduring some harm from this, let alone the person who was the intended aggressed in the situation. I'm going to explain some of those dynamics, but thank you all for sharing. Unfortunately, because of time, we're not going to have the time to process the second image. But you can do that on your own. This one is kind of verbally saying what's going on. You're not like the rest of them, kind of going off of that stereotype of, if you're a Black person and you are graduating from college, that you are an exception to the rule somehow, right? So that kind of is where this is going off of that image. But what that does say is that people that do say, oh, you're so articulate, or you're not like the rest of them, right? That means that I have thoughts about what the rest of them are like, right? So it always reveals something about the person, these communications. But thank you for engaging in this. I think this is a very helpful activity to engage in, especially as we are interrogating our own biases. So looking at images, even like when you open up a magazine, maybe you're not thinking about that as your time to work on your implicit biases, but when you notice something in marketing, right, that is not feeling so good, or that might be targeting somebody at the expense of somebody else, interrogate that. Think about what's going on there, right? That might help not only to reveal possibly a bias that you might have, that might also give you some language that you can use when you bring these issues up to other people. And so some of the defining characteristics of microaggressions, which I think are important to consider, are that they often occur because of a clash of worldviews or racial realities. If we're thinking about racial microaggressions, that idea that every single one of us has a different worldview. Now, our worldview is that filter that has developed over time that we use to take in and make sense of the world around us, right? And we all have a different worldview. And so it's likely that whenever we come across anybody different than us or anybody else, period, even if they come from our same family, right? I've still experienced microaggressions from my family, even though we share a common lineage and a common heritage. I still experience microaggressions in some way, shape, or form. There's the invisibility of unintentional expressions of bias, right? For all too long, previous to microaggression research, Bias was really studied in terms of overt things that were happening, things that were, and being discriminatory, there was an intent component that was often embedded in that definition. Well, we know that that's not true. We can still be discriminatory and not have the intent, right? And so when we think about microaggressions not causing much harm, and that's what keeps them invisible. When we don't address them on a regular basis, that's what keeps them invisible, right? Because they happen very frequently. Another thing I forgot to mention, this is the term microaggression. That term micro isn't meant to mean that it's little or that it has small impact or anything. Micro is just to signify that this occurs on a regular basis, right? That they're so frequently occurring. That's what micro means in microaggression. I'm often having just a correct language. People often think that, no, it's actually belittling the work that we're doing. I'm like, no, it's actually saying that these things occur so frequently. That's why they're called microaggressions. The perceived minimal harm. So you take any one instance of microaggression, right? So somebody saying you're not like the rest of them. Just that one comment in isolation is likely not going to lead to significant compromises in my well-being. It's likely not to disrupt my career path or my educational path, but it's the accumulation of microaggressions over the course of one's days, one's weeks, one's years, that when they go unprocessed, lead to the compromises that research time and time again is showing to be connected to microaggression. So every study that I've been a part of or that I've reviewed has showed that there have been some kind of significant impact on whatever that outcome variable is. So be that mental health well-being, be that educational attainment, be that the quality of the employment climate, et cetera. All of those, the research shows that it does lead to harm. And then we have this catch-22. This is partially why microaggressions have been kind of under the radar, have been kept invisible, is because folks have not been primed or taught how to deal with them or how to even have the language. Prior to the mid-2000s, the term microaggression was only understood in small circles in the law and in education, and some in psychology. But because of a major article that was published by my mentor in the mid-2000s, and American Psychologist, that really launched it. And so now it's kind of a mainstream term. And so now we have that language to use. And when I first started doing this work, that was one of the first comments someone would give me after a workshop is, oh, thank you for actually giving me now a term and a language to make sense of an everyday experience that I thought was just me kind of going crazy. And that's the language that they often use. Right. But there's this catch-22. So you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So I go back to that image of that young person in that friend group, right, who was being made fun of because of ethnicity. And I think about what he had to lose. So if he were to mention, so say he knew that this was going on, right? What does he have to lose if he brings it up to them? Maybe he has his social standing in that group to kind of, that's kind of on the line. It's also important to point out that there's a celebrity in that group as well. And so maybe there's some proximity to power or what have you that this person would now have to sacrifice. Maybe they'd be called the troublemaker. Maybe they wouldn't be invited out in the future, right? But the other part is that now if I don't say something, right, that now I'm forced to live with this microaggression by myself, right? And that's where the damage can be done. When we don't have space or a place to process the microaggression, it just builds up. It creates a pressure cooker of sorts, and then that eventually is going to translate into some kind of compromise. And we're even finding these compromises to manifest physically as well, where people will even rate their global rating of health, which is a self-report. One question, how do you rate your health globally or in general? But that question by itself is related to mortality rates. So we have an idea of our wellness, right? There's something kind of innately intuitive within us, right? And so we're even showing that people that endure more microaggressions rate themselves more lower on the global rating of health, which again is related to mortality. Other examples, so again, these are all over the place. We know that all gender restrooms, or what are often called gender neutral restrooms, are often an issue, especially on our colleges and university campuses. But when we see a restroom that has just two, men and women, right? That's a gender microaggression, right? Where do folks go who don't fit within that binary gender, right? Where do they feel safe to go? And gender identity happens to be one of the main areas I work within. And I know that my trans students often report that they watch how much water they take on a regular basis, especially in new situations, because they don't know if there's going to be a safe place for them to relieve themselves, right? Who in this group has had to think about their water intake for safety reasons, right? I often think about it because of commuting from in New York. Sometimes it takes over an hour, and that's my main issue, but it's not because of safety. It's so I don't have an accident, right? That's what we should be concerned about. We shouldn't be concerned about relieving ourselves because of safety issues. And that's what trans and non-binary people are reporting. That's why bathroom issues are a significant and real issue. We just think also about what messaging says about just norms. And this one is taken from a holiday catalog of a major department store. And this was only a few years ago. And if you can't read this, it says, spike your best friend's eggnog when they're not looking. And the image is of what seems like a woman identified person laughing with her head thrown back, looking to the side, and an image of maybe a male presenting figure, kind of only half of his face, kind of creepily looking even right over at this person. This is basically defending rape, right? This is all about sexual assault, this messaging. And so then we shouldn't be surprised that sexual assault is a major issue in our society and on our campuses when these are the kinds of mainstream messagings that we're contending with, right? So this had to go through many levels of marketing. I do consulting in the marketing world, and I know how long it takes to just get one image out there. So we know that many brains had to process this, and still it was allowed. Still the messaging of it's okay to basically date rape your colleague, right? That's not okay. We think about what students are saying, right? And so the limited representation of my race in your classroom doesn't make me the voice of all Black people. Students of color often report either being racially spotlighted, like this student, where they're not asked to bring the intellect that they individually have, but instead they're only being seen as the group that they are assumed to represent, and they're being asked to be the representative voice of all that group. And we know that that's not possible. None of us can be the representative of our groups. We can only say what it's like for me to be a member of this group and to have these ideas. The counter to that is racial ignoring. And so either students are spotlighted where they're asked to be the representation of their entire group, or they're often ignored where they're not even called on to begin with in class. We see this also happen with women. This middle one has to do with colorblindness. And that's also an ableist term that we should not be using as well. But Courtney, I never see you as a Black girl. And then she has hashtag open your eyes, right? And so there's these colorblind attitudes that we often see mask biases, right? All they're doing is masking it. Whenever somebody says, I don't see race, I don't see color, I'm like, well, you're choosing not to, because it's a very, even though it is a created phenomenon that people did as a mechanism of oppression, it is still very much a lived experience in this country of being a racialized people. And when someone says, I don't see you as your race, I'm like, well, what do you see me as then? I'm like, I know you see me as something because you also are racialized in this country, right? Nobody is immune from being racialized in this country, or actually in the world at this point. And then the last one I often say is my favorite one. And I say that jokingly because my last name, I've been given every Latinx last name out there: Rodriguez, Ramirez, Gonzalez, Martinez. The list goes on and on. It's become a joke in my friend circles. It's so frequently. I was just introduced. I was giving a talk on microaggressions last week, and the people that invited me introduced me as Dr. David Ramirez. I'm like, okay, now I'm going to have to now reveal some of those possible biases when I reveal this slide. But anyhow, this young person was giving a talk on racism, but was given the wrong last name. Names are very important. Now, albeit I'll give people some leeway to make pronunciation mistakes, but only at the beginning. We should ask, how do you pronounce your name? And unless we have some kind of a speech issue, right, which many people have speech issues that might preclude them from enunciating certain words or sounds, we have the ability to learn this, right? And so we should try to learn this at the very least. And we shouldn't give people nicknames without their consent. I often have seen professors do this in their classes where they can't pronounce somebody's name, and so they give them a nickname of their own choosing, which we shouldn't do as well. Names are important. They're often an important source of identity. We can think about gender microaggressions and sexual orientation microaggressions, which these hit on. The middle one, asking someone who is gender non-binary, are you a man or a woman? That is also bias, because that's also a binary way of thinking about gender. And this is this person's business. We shouldn't have to be, because we might be just uncomfortable with how somebody is presenting, we shouldn't attribute that discomfort or position that onto somebody else. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly. I'm noticing our time is running out. But as I mentioned, microaggressions and these biases have impacts on everything that I've noticed that have been studied. So emotional issues, they have an increase in depression and anxiety symptoms. They also have a decrease. The more microaggressions one experiences in a setting, the less likely they are to seek help from that setting. And I really take this one to heart when I think about microaggressions on college campuses. So if students report experiencing microaggressions on campus, they are less likely to seek out support from that campus, meaning that they are less likely to even go to the college counseling center or their advisor to seek out support for these issues, right? And so they're kind of even in a more isolated situation. So we got to think about that. So if students are saying they're experiencing microaggressions, how are we going to reach those students who, again, are going to be turned off from the very campus that is aggressing them? Physical issues that I mentioned, there's a decrease in cognitive processing speed, with people that are kind of having to make sense of these ambiguous forms of discrimination. They can propagate stereotype threat, which has been studied time and time again. It's that idea that just by being reminded of your group, of being a woman or being a person of color before you take a test or are asked to perform in some way, can lead you to perform in stereotypic or in lower productive ways. Imposter phenomenon. So this idea that I'm a phony or I'm a fake, right, is very much related to experiences with discrimination. I still am a victim of imposter phenomenon. I still have that voice in my head that tells me I'm not worthy or that my work isn't valuable when I know that it is, right? But that's really the oppressor's voice that has been embedded. Dignitary harm, which you're not going to find much written on, but I heard the critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw speak about it. It's the idea that when our entire self is not valued, is not affirmed, when, let's say, I'm experiencing gender microaggressions in the workplace, and so I choose to kind of code the way I speak about my gender, which means that I'm not bringing myself fully in, that is actually going to do harm to our dignity or our sense of self-worth, right? Our dignity is our sense of worthiness. It's what gives us that sense of motivation to pursue our dreams, right? To pursue an education, to pursue our dream job, right? To pursue those relationships that we think are meaningful. When our dignity is compromised, right, that's going to have an impact on those opportunities that we are seeking to secure, right? It's going to have an impact on us fulfilling our optimizing our fullest potentials. Again, going in more. So what can you do? Going to implicit.harvard.edu. That's where you can take the whole suite of implicit association tests. Now there's not just tests for groups, there's tests for ideas and thoughts and what have you. So thoughts about substances and substance use, for example. Thoughts about mental health treatment and psychotropic medications. So going there can be very helpful to kind of learn about our biases in various areas. But I also recommend you do it often. I told you I do this on a yearly basis because I need to keep my biases in check. And then also I recommend going to outsmartinghumanminds.org. That's Dr. Banaji's website, where it's a repository of a lot of different professional development activities that you can engage in with your colleagues or by yourself, where you can help to, again, intentionally unlearn these biases. Something that we can do on our jobs is, many of us are involved in upholding policies and procedures, but we should also be involved in augmenting and redesigning these policies and procedures, especially those that are inequitable, right? Or that are not kind of encouraging a sense of inclusion and belongingness. I often think that we need to think about building a community of care and starting with cultural humility, especially as an instructor. This is how I approach my classes. I approach it knowing that my students are going to come in with a certain set of knowledge and experiences that may be aligned with mine, but are often different, right? And I need to kind of understand what those are as we work together. This comes from the therapy world, but we're starting to use cultural humility as a way of being across all of our settings that we come into contact with other people. And all this really means is it's really asking you to get out of your own mind, get out of your own uniqueness, get out of your own individuality, and think about how something, even a very basic concept, may be understood differently by somebody else. And so in my classes, I might even ask as an opening question, okay, everybody, we're going to have a discussion about what education means to you. Now, everybody write down what comes to mind with what education means to you. Write down some words, write down a few statements, some brainstorming. When we do the group share, and I do it often a word cloud, I find that education means something different to everybody, right? But if I'm an educator, I need to start with that. I need to start with where are they coming from in terms of what education means for them. And that's probably going to have an impact on then how I am going to teach these students. And we can do that with everything. We can do that in our meetings, right? We can do that with our colleagues. And this is going to, again, increase our understanding of people. That's the goal, is to increase understanding. Not to create it such that everyone is thinking the same way. No, we don't want that. We don't want to produce automatons. We want to produce unique thinkers, unique beings, but people who are aware of their biases and are not letting those filter out into other people. Again, as I mentioned, I was going to share that 4-step part for disarming microaggressions. The first part is to make the communication visible. Again, they're often invisible. And so we need to make this communication visible. And so if somebody comes up to me after a talk and they're like, oh, you were very articulate when you were giving the presentation. Now, I understand that word articulate to be coded often, and I'm just going to assume that to be the case. And so what I might say is, oh, I'm glad that I came out articulately, and I've been speaking English since I was born, and I'm glad that I've mastered the language as good as I have right now. So in that way, I haven't told the person, you know, you made a wrong mistake. All I did was try to clarify something that that I'm understanding to be possibly a miscommunication. And I'm sending a message that possibly your understanding of who I am is incorrect, and this is the truth of who I am. And this is why I was articulate, right? And so I'm making that meta communication explicit. We have to disarm it by expressing some kind of disagreement. Oftentimes people might not be able to have the words to say, but we have nonverbal communication. We can furrow our brow, we can cross our arms. There are many ways of communicating disagreement without having to use our words, right? So maybe even using nonverbal communication. Educating the offender, as I mentioned before, we need to move from an intent conversation to an impact conversation. So if I'm vicariously observing this interaction and I'm intervening, I might say, you know, I was hurt by witnessing this because this made me think about XYZ or what have you, but share how the impact was experienced by you. And then the last one is to seek support or external intervention, or to report it if appropriate. Hopefully there are reporting mechanisms on campus for reports of bias. If there aren't, let's think about creating them, right? Seeking support though, going to your peer group or to those that you trust, right? We should all have them. I have on my phone several text groups that I reach out to whenever I experience a microaggression, and I reach out to them. But getting support and also reporting it if necessary. Again, engaging with culture has to occur from the very beginning. So I encourage us all to bring up culture from our very first classes or experiences with students and with people, being aware of our power, right? Especially if we are in a position of power, that we need to do everything in our power to reduce that, right? Breaking these hierarchies is really important. Checking our assumptions along the way. Watching our language when we use harmful language to correct it, right? Oftentimes, I know my students, and we work on this hard, is that when we refer to a mixed group of people, that we don't call them guys, right? We often revert to the masculine when we refer to generalities, but let's get away from that. Being prepared for cultural ruptures. We're going to make mistakes, but we can repair them, right? And what I want us to leave with is, at the very least, if we see something, that we say something, right? If we see something, say something. We have that mantra in our mind for public safety when it comes to bombs and what have you, but we can do the same with microaggressions and with unintentional demonstrations of our implicit biases, that when we see something or we experience something, that we do something about it, especially if we're the ones doing it. So much learning can happen from being able to demonstrate, our humility, especially with our students. Like when I'm able to say, oh, I just committed a microaggression, I'm sorry about that. This is how I understood it. How did you all understand it? That always builds the understanding and builds the trust. Rarely does it destroy anything, right? It's always going to be there, so we might as well bring it to light. So some ending questions. I wanted us to kind of do some processing, but we are out of time, so I'm going to end it here. If you'd like to keep in contact or have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me directly or via Melissa. On Twitter, you can follow me there, but I leave my email here just in case there are any follow-up questions or if there's any resources that I can share. But thank you all for being here, for being captivated, and I'm sorry for going over time, Melissa.
No worries, because it was really very impactful, and I appreciate you joining us today. Thanks for sharing some strategies. I like that 4-step model in particular, but I also like the messaging that we already know around see something and say something. It definitely applies here. I do think oftentimes microaggressive statements go unaddressed because people don't know quite how to handle it. So I hope you all had an opportunity to hear something new and that you'll incorporate it into the work that we do in your classrooms, in your offices, and other workspaces. I want to thank Dave again for being here with us. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank Strategic Marketing for orchestrating, as always, a fantastic Zoom experience. I do want to remind you or let you know of some upcoming program that's going to take place on November 8th. We will be celebrating our for the first time, First Generation College Student Day. And we've got 3 programs planned for that day. We're going to have an Our Voices panel highlighting first generation college student perspectives. We're going to have a professional development session for faculty and staff, where we'll have a speaker who will share strategies to help college professionals better understand and meet the needs of first-gen Latinx students. And we'll have an invitation-only networking event for first-generation college students and faculty and staff who identify as first-generation college students. The day promises to be really fun, but also with an opportunity to learn some things. I think everyone can learn a little bit more to help our first-generation students on campus. So thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and look forward to seeing you at other events. Take care.